development. He is professor of philosophy at the University of Connecticut. Before that, he was a professor at the University of Virginia, and he also spent a year recently in Germany in Bochum as a Mercator Research Fellow. He received his PhD back in '93 in Pittsburgh with a dissertation on illocutions and attitudes. You see, he's interested in speech acts for a very long time. This was under the supervision of persons like Robert Brandom, for example, who is, of course, very important for us for this topic as well. He is working especially on the philosophy of language and particularly on the nature of speech acts, and this remained one of the central topics in his research. He has several book publications, such as a recent overview about the philosophy of language with Oxford University Press, or Know Thyself, The Value and Limits of Self-Knowledge, 2018. Also a volume on, an edited volume on Moore's paradox. And there is a host of very important and insightful articles on speech acts like assertions, expressives, emotive meanings, and also on discourse, coherence, and common ground. And his influence on the field can be seen by the fact that there are two recent collections centering around his work. One on the origins of meaning and the nature of speech acts, a special issue of Organon Philosophia, and another one, Sources of Meaning, Themes from the Philosophy of Mitch Green, a special issue of the Grazer Philosophische Studien. For me personally, his work on assertions is of great importance, and also on his work on the non-embeddability of speech acts. So for me, his article, or your article in 2000 on the Frege point, illocutionary force and semantic content, was very important, even though I try to argue that the notion of embedding of speech acts is not quite as crazy as it sounds, and maybe has some explanative virtue. And today he will talk about verbal signaling, parentheticals, evidentials, and some self-ascription. And this will be followed by a commentary by Bart Geurts. He's professor at Radboud University in Nijmegen. There he's chair for language philosophy and logic. I happen to know Bart for a very long time, going back to the late 80s, I think, when he was absolutely crucial in developing a computational linguistics project at IBM in Stuttgart. And he has done essential work on presuppositions and the nature of presuppositions in discourse, partly together with his academic teacher, Rob van der Zandt. He's worked on many other topics since, for example, on scalar implicatures, on denial, on vexed issues like the difference between modified numbers like a number of words like more than 6 and at least 5. And he has expanded his professional attention to include cognitive science in general. And even though he's a philosopher, a declared philosopher, or earns money as a philosopher, he's doing experiments. He is particularly relevant for the topic of speech acts because he's done substantial work on the notion of commitment, which he considers a social notion different from the notion of belief, and he analyzes assertions essentially with the help of this social notion of commitment. So we have a talk of about 40, maximally maybe 45 minutes, and 10 minutes of discussion, and then I open the discussion to everyone and will switch off the recording.
There we go. So just to give you an overview then, this panel here, and I should also say, if those of you in the audience are unable to feel like you're just having trouble understanding what I'm saying, either because the sound is bad or because I say something that you heard what I said, but it's confusing, please go ahead and stop me while I'm speaking. Interrupt if you can, and try to raise your hand while I'm speaking. I don't want anybody to be feeling like they're not following. But if, of course, if you disagree, then we'll keep that for Q&A. That presupposes that you feel you understand. And I just wanted to say also thank you very much to Manfred and colleagues for inviting me. I'm honored and delighted to be part of this conversation, and I'm looking forward to Bart's comments. I also have this incredibly high opinion of Bart Geurts as a philosopher and researcher, and so I'm looking forward to his comments as well. So thanks everybody for being here. So here's the general overview. It is widely accepted that performing a speech act, such as an assertion or a promise. Speaker undertakes a commitment, but this notion of commitment exhibits multiple dimensions in my view. And in disentangling them, I think we can discern some proto-illocutionary acts that exhibit some, but not all, of the dimensions of commitment that we find in acts such as assertion. Some of these proto-acts can help shed light on the force, such as it may be, with which we indicate the epistemic status of the things that we say, such as occurs with grammatical evidentials as well as with parentheticals. And so I'm going to try to conceptualize these phenomena under the term that I use, verbal signaling, and there could be differentiations within that category. And the study is part of a larger project of viewing speech acts through the lens of cultural evolution. I'll have a little bit to say about cultural evolution before my time is out. Let's see if I can go forward. Okay. So the overall outline is going to be, I'll start with signal stability and indices. Then I'll talk about verbal signals, verbal indices, talk about assertion and what I call the assertive family, talk a little bit about cultural evolution and a way of thinking about speech acts from a genealogical point of view. And then I'll talk about some applications and give you the big picture. All right, so another way of putting my project in large terms is going to be to ask the question, how much cognitive and or social sophistication is needed for different levels of communication? We can draw an analogy. I'm thinking of this on an analogy with what's known as the Chomsky hierarchy for understanding the expressive power of various languages. Push-down automata and various other things are used to describe various kinds of grammatical complexity, known as the Chomsky hierarchy. One way of thinking about my question is to ask, can we do something like that for the evolution of what we now call speech acts? That is, can we say something informative about the space between communication in a broad sense and the sophisticated uses of language with the forced content differentiation and such familiar to our own species? And I don't want to assume that just because speech acts proper are apparently unique to our species, that all verbal communication is illocutionary. And I should, just by way of clarifying terminologies that we're not talking past each other, by illocutionary, I mean speech acts in the traditional Austinian sense, that is, acts of the sort that one can perform by saying and meaning that you're doing so. So notice that acts of speech, what traditionally we call illocutionary acts, are not as such speech acts that are called illocutionary acts. We're talking about speech acts proper. All right, so I want to back up, get a very big picture now, talk about communication in a way that does not presuppose minds or intentions or anything of the sort. This comes a little bit from the evolutionary biology of communication. So starting out, first point is that information is all around us. When I sweat, I convey information. Waves in the sea convey information. Tree rings convey information about the age of the tree. So that's one concept, not a communication yet. Design does not presuppose an intelligent, sentient designer, so that your heart is designed to pump blood, your skin is designed for thermoregulation. I want to make use of this notion of design in my counter communication as well. These are two notions, neither of which is communicative per se. But I do want to understand communication as the designed transmission of information. That's important to me. So that communication permits but does not require communicative intentions, doesn't even require minds. And I'll come back and give you an example of that. A signal is according to this picture, an action or trait designed to transmit information. Signals are inherently, by definition, communicative. And signaling is pervasive among non-human animals and even in other kingdoms. They don't have to be animals. Plants very likely signal. Contentful language is one way of signaling, but we also find it in the human case, things like intonation, prosody, gestures, and facial expressions, which may or may not be intentional. And just for those of you who know about my earlier work, I consider expression as a matter of roughly a matter of signaling our psychological states, but one can signal without expressing anything. Example, here's a brightly colored Amazonian tree frog. Beautiful as it is, it's also highly toxic. And I would say it signals its toxicity. An evolutionary biologist in communication will say something like, its bright coloration means that it's toxic. What kind of meaning is this, you might ask? Well, notice that a mutant might be born into a population of brightly colored tree frogs, but that mutant might not be toxic. I would say that mutant still signals its toxicity, but it's not toxic. And we could express that with the sentence such as, in this population, bright coloration means that he's toxic, but he's not. And if that's a coherent way of speaking, then signaling, as I understand that notion, is not what Grice would call natural meaning. But of course, the signaling can happen, surely does happen, without the frog intending to convey the message. And so it's certainly not speaker meaning in Grice's sense either. Which is to say, what I call organic meaning is a larger category, subsuming non-natural meaning, speaker meaning. So that is to say, non-natural meaning and natural meaning, in the traditional Gricean terms, do not constitute an exhaustive dichotomy. What's, so to speak, in between? Organic meaning. But notice that the way I use organic meaning, that subsumes speaker meaning, but does not include natural meaning. When we think about communication from this biological perspective, we can also raise nice questions, I think, about stability. A signaling system is prone to invasion by what we might call deceptive mutants, such as the type of frog I just talked about. Such mimics would deter predation more cheaply than their honest cousins, because a brightly colored tree frog that has no toxicity, but is still brightly colored, poison is expensive to produce, and it takes resources in your own body to protect yourself against it. And so such mimics have an advantage. They can do their thing more cheaply than their, so to speak, honest cousins. And then they will have a greater chance of surviving. Then there's a good chance they'll swamp the population, which would then cause the signaling system to break down, because potential predators eventually will figure out that the brightly colored tree frogs are not actually toxic. So are there solutions to this problem? Are signaling systems always destined to become unstable and break down? I think not. There are examples in which organisms not just, so to speak, say something, but also show it. So in the case of the funnel web spider, we have spiders that compete over control of webs. Webs are hard to build, and they compete by their way of competing involves vibrating on the web. And the bigger you are, obviously, the more intense your vibration. And it's been shown experimentally that the larger spiders win these contests without them having to go into combat. Notice that the vibration magnitude is a direct readout, or what I would call an index, of your size, of what the biologists will call your resource holding potential. Another example that may be more controversial is the stalk-eyed fly. The eye stalks might be considered a so-called handicap. It's thought to show the genetic viability of the creature. Stalk-eyed flies with longer eye stalks, males, have a better chance of finding mates. That's been established experimentally as well. So these are ways of not just saying, so to speak, signaling something, but also showing that something is the case. That'll be important for us going forward. Part 2. Can we talk about signals and indices in the context of a language, or at least a proto-language? Well, let me say this is about lay down some stipulations. An indicative sentence S whose truth conditions are, just speak with a semanticist, boxes S, is designed to be used as a signal that the actual situation is a member of S. S is going to be a set. That's what truth conditions are. So I'm going to construe a sufficient, not necessary condition, but sufficient condition for verbal signaling as follows. One who utters an indicative sentence S with the objective of conveying the information encoded by S, thereby verbally signals that information. By the way, I'm following David Armstrong from an old and largely forgotten article of his, which argues that notion of objectives is a better concept to use than intentions in understanding meaning and communication. Objectives does not carry all the philosophical baggage that notion of intention does. I can come back to that and talk about that in Q&A. And then notice that if somebody says, I bet you $100 that Liverpool wins the match, for example, uttered under the right conditions, constitute a commitment to win or lose $100 depending upon the outcome of the match. Those right conditions include uptake, knowing what he's getting himself into, having the conceptual structure, having the ability to make bets, and so forth. I'm going to call these conditions C1 through Cn. And in general, I'm going to make use of this notion of C1 through Cn. It's sort of a rough way of indicating the conditions that have to be met for what we roughly might think of as a performative, as meeting the same makes it so property. So if these conditions are met, then we've got a sufficient condition for verbal indexing. A verbal signal that meets these conditions is also a verbal index. That is to say, verbal indexing is factive. If you verbally signal that S with a sentence token that is also a verbal index, that is to say you meet those conditions, then S. Next part, I'm trying to go through this quickly because I have a lot of things I want to get through. Part 3 is I want to then carry some of this over to what I call the assertive family and tell you about the notion that it's understanding of illocutionary commitment. Commitment is widely accepted as a way of characterizing speech acts. John Searle once said, an assertion of P is an undertaking to the effect that P, back in 1969. This is an opaque formulation. What does it mean to undertake something to the effect that P? You can undertake a project. What is propositional undertaking? Searle, I think, never really makes that clear. And many other authors, certainly not all, but many other authors, the notion of commitment is often left as an unanalyzed primitive. Searle might rephrase the notion of undertaking as commitment, but it still doesn't tell us much what that is. But my contention, here's a big contention that I want to offer you today, is that our contemporary notion of commitment is associated with assertion and related speech acts is a hybrid notion. It's made up of different strands, so to speak. Let me try to explain why. Think about, here's a table for you. On the top, or second to the top row, I guess, for assertion. I want to say when you make an assertion, there are 3 commitment-related notions that are at play. 1, when you make an assertion that P, you are liable to be right or wrong on the issue of P, depending upon whether P is true or false. That's what I call liability. You're expected, these are norms. The other norm is that you're expected to believe what you say. And that's what I call frankness. You could call it sincerity, but frankness gives you more chances for alliteration. And the third column is fidelity. When you make an assertion, you're expected to provide strong justification if you're challenged. Whether that justification has to rise to the level of knowledge or something else, the topic for the philosophers, for epistemologists to worry about. For me, it's not crucial to settle those issues. But if this is accurate, then when we say that assertion involves undertaking of a commitment, that actually has 3 different dimensions that in principle might be capable of being disentangled. Compare that with the norms that govern, for example, conjecture. When you conjecture that P, you are allowed to be right or wrong. That's why you've got it. Why here? Yes, for each of these questions. Are you expected to be frank? Well, you should at least have some reason to think the content is true. Perhaps you should have an intention to investigate. And if you're challenged, you should be able to, well, provide some justification of challenge, readiness to determine the truth value of the content at the very least. If somebody says, however, how do you know when you make a conjecture, you're entitled to look them in the eye and say, that's a conjecture, it's not an assertion. You misunderstood what I'm doing. So that's to say that assertion and conjecture are governed by different norms. They share the first one. They differ on frankness. They differ on fidelity. And we can go through the rest of this list and see the different ways in which members of what I call the assertive family differ from each other in subtle ways, depending upon that I think is brought out by disentangling these 3 notions of commitment. I should say that I think the bottom 2 rows here, sheer guess and supposition, the way I understand this is part of the stipulative. It's just that they would not count as members of the assertive family per se. I'd consider them cousins, because for sheer guess, I don't think there's any sincerity condition or frankness condition, nor I think is there any fidelity. Unlike an educated guess, which is very close to a conjecture. Supposition, likewise, I think does not have a yes for all these columns. And so for that reason, I would say, I'm not sure it's a member of the assertive family proper. But the assertive family and then its cousins allow us to get some, I think, a theoretical handle on the ways in which the notion of commitment is multifaceted, depends upon it's built out of different things. I should also say I want to use the notion of illocutionary commitment in what follows. Notice that assertion is not deductively closed. If you assert that P and P entails Q, you haven't thereby asserted Q. But as assertoric commitment is deductively closed, if you assert P and P entails Q, you're assertorically committed to Q, even if you haven't asserted Q. I might have misspoken in the last sentence. What I meant to say, if you assert that P and P entails Q, you have not thereby asserted Q, but you are assertorically committed. What does it mean to be assertorically committed? Well, I think that comes out if you distinguish assertoric commitment from conjectural commitment and other kinds of commitment. So commitment is sensitive to illocutionary mode. Note that commitment only carries liability and fidelity norms. One can't reasonably be expected to be in a psychological state backing up, that is, making sincere, every proposition that you're committed to. That would be unduly demanded. So commitment, illocutionary commitment, carries with it 2 out of the 3, but not all those 3 norms. All right. So another sort of deep, big picture perspective I want to bring to this discussion is cultural evolution. Behaviors and practices might develop through learning rather than being genetically coded. know that. And this occurs in non-human animals, but the primary locus of research on what's called cultural evolution is our own species. And some behaviors are more adaptive to others, of course, though it's not always easy to verify that. And not all cultural change is evolutionary. Notice that we can distinguish in English between evolved into and evolved to. Evolved into just refers to change. Evolved to suggests something more like the new practice did a new job that had not been done before and gave us an advantage of some kind in our natural environment. So there are some mechanisms that writers who concern themselves with cultural evolution often point to. First of all, transmission is not just vertical, I mean, that is genetic from parent to offspring, but also horizontal from sibling to sibling or peer to peer, and what they call oblique. I could learn things from my uncle or from my teacher. Learning may be cumulative. That gives us what's known as the ratchet effect. Neither teaching nor learning has to be intentional. You can figure out something new without notice that you figured out something new. Just find yourself doing it. It works. Likewise, learning. Culturally evolved practices serve or once served a role, but just as in genetic evolution, we can leave open the possibility that there are sponges as well as acceptations. And there's no prediction that practices that result from cultural evolution will be pan-cultural. For example, think about the practice of supposing something for the sake of argument. Some of my linguistic anthropology friends would say that there are cultures that they've studied in which people never suppose anything for the sake of argument. That might be a culturally specific illocutionary practice. Cultural evolution might in turn affect genetic features of a population, and one case of that is lactose tolerance among European adults. Okay. So now I'm gonna, as you can probably see this coming, but speech acts and the way I want to approach them are going to be turn out to be social institutions with a history, and they may also, here's a conjecture that I think has some support but needs more investigation, may also be products of cultural evolution. That is, can we conceptualize evolutionary precursors of speech acts like assertions and promises? If we could do so, if we were to do so, we'd probably want to posit primitive kinds of force and content. And what might those be? I'm talking about force and content because I take them to be crucial building blocks out of which modern day speech acts are built. What might those primitive kinds of force and content be? Well, first I'll talk about a primitive kind of content or semanticity, and then I'll talk about a primitive kind of force. So I assume everybody knows about the vervet monkeys. Let's imagine, I'll do some science fiction, I guess, talk about a vervish proto-language. So in this proto-language, we have, in addition to 4 noun-like terms for different kinds of predator, A is for raptor, B for leopard, C for snake, D is also for raptor, it's a synonym of it. They also possess 4 predicate-like terms for characterizing them. F is large, G is small, H is near, K is far. And then concatenations, monadic predications of such expressions will produce 16 possible verbish expressions possessing truth conditions like the following. FA is true if and only if there's a large raptor. KC is true if and only if there's a distant snake, and so on. There are 2 ways in which this kind of proto-language is primitive. First of all, it doesn't have any connectives or complementizers, tense markings, evidentials. It's only got a very primitive kind of compositionality, and that's enough for monadic predication, but no more. It's got no recursion, certainly. I wouldn't call it language. And there's a considerable indeterminacy. That is to say, if I can gloss FA as being true if and only if there's a large raptor, there's going to be other equally empirically adequate ways of glossing the semantic content of FA. And that's okay with me. That doesn't make the project unintelligible, but it does suggest that there's going to be lots of indeterminacy in the air for this kind of discussion. But if a speaker comes out with something we want to translate as FA, A is F, then we might ask, what is the force of a tokening of that utterance? Well, given the complex and demanding norms that we now associate with assertion, that assertion is not a likely candidate. And not just because of the primitives of the content, but if I'm right about the normative demands for assertion, a speaker of verbish is not likely to do what we would call make an assertion. But could there be evolutionary precursors to assertion that are better ways of describing what the speaker is doing? Well, one approach starts with disentangling the aspects of commitment that I suggested on the liability, frankness, and fidelity table that I showed you a couple of slides ago. Here's my very badly drawn partial Boolean algebra. So at the very top, we've got liability, frankness, and fidelity. Then we've got all 3 of the possible 2-member subsets of them: liability and frankness, liability and fidelity, frankness and fidelity. And then we could talk about the subsets of those. I didn't bother to put the bottom of this algebra. And my suggestion is, let's think about a path that goes along this side, so that first we have what I'm going to call assertion. I'll come back and tell you what that means, but essentially just guided by the liability norm. Semi-assertion, liability and frankness, and then their evolutionary descendant would be what we now think of as modern day assertion. So again, assertion is governed only by the liability norm, and that one who asserts that P, again, that's short for assertion, one who asserts that P is liable to being correct or not, depending upon whether P is true. Not expected to believe P or have any other psychological state we might call a sincerity condition, and the speaker doesn't need to be prepared to defend P if challenged, even if they had the semantic resources for doing so. Semi-assertion is governed only by the liability and frankness norms. It's stronger than assertion involving two commitments rather than one, but when semi-asserts that P still doesn't need to defend P if challenged. Note that a practice adhering only to frankness we might call venting. A practice that involves only fidelity we might call devil's advocacy. But it's not plausible, at least to me, that either is likely precursor to modern assertion. I think of them as practices that become possible once we begin to isolate different norms. And so now I want to try to give you a story according to which assertion might be useful, but I'm going to say in a moment, leave something to be desired. Verbish tokening of FA might have begun as assertion. Speakers might be liable to explicit or subtle sanctions if wrong, receive benefits if correct. And sanctions and benefits include things like decreased or increased status as measured by dominance, ranking, access to mates, food, grooming, etc. Or sometimes being wrong is costly for not just you, but the whole community. Many of us get eaten or something. But notice that there's no expectations about speaker belief and thus no sanctions if the speaker does not believe the content of what was asserted. So the idea is that assertion, you can imagine having a role to play in a linguistic community or proto-linguistic community. But I would say signaling without belief, that is assertion, leaves something to be desired. That's what that LSTBD stands for. We do have attested cases of punishment of signalers who seem to lie. So there's food over here, and I alarm call to get everybody else out of this part of the tree, and then I go eat the food. Notice that lying is different from being wrong. People in at least American English say things like, I lied when they were merely mistaken, but I'm using lying in a more specific way. Now, when we move from assertion to semi-assertion, we are expecting that lie detection requires a rudimentary theory of mind, where the world corresponds to what the person is representing as being the case. So signaling norms that are sensitive to both correctness, that's liability, and sincerity, that is frankness, are more demanding and thus, I conjecture, better adapted to knowledge transmission. And I'm just assuming as part of the background for that in the absence of sincerity norms, speaker beliefs are more reliable indicators of fact than are their utterances. So if you're expected only to say what you believe, you're more likely to track the truth more accurately. That's an assumption that I'm making, I want to be clear about. So that's what would be the evolutionary pressure that would move us in a cultural evolutionary path from assertion to semi-assertion. That's just a better way of tracking the truth. But even semi-assertion leaves something to be desired. But note that is to say, if you don't have to give reasons for what you say, we might think of you as kind of opining. Being prepared to give reasons for something is a demanding standard, though. And here's a testable conjecture. Adding a fidelity requirement, going from semi-assertion to assertion, makes speakers more likely to know what they say rather than just what I'd call opining. Norms governing assertion go some way towards making assertion an index of knowledge. An index of knowledge, that is to say, you show what is the case rather than just indicate it. And they might do so by making assertion proper akin to a biological handicap in a way that I argued in a 2009 Mind and Language paper. I won't try to go through that argument now. But you might even go take a step further and say that asserters are more like the stalk-eyed flies than funnel web spiders. But I'm not claiming that for today's purposes. But just by way of giving you a little bit of reason for that, assertion is costly in that it exposes us to reputation loss, at least epistemic visual commitments. And how much cost we pay depends upon which aspect of commitment we've infringed upon. All right, so I want to give some applications in the time that I've got left. Very briefly, I want to talk about some self-ascriptions that correspond roughly to what J.L. Austin would have called expositives. Many of you remember from way back that Jonathan Cohen and his do illocutionary forces exist raised a problem for self-ascriptions of force, such as I claim that P. I claim that P is normally used to assert the P. But I claim that P is not transparent in the way that it is true that P is. By transparent, I mean it doesn't add any substantial semantic content. And notice that I claim that P is going to have a different role to play from I conjecture that P. Both ways of putting forth P, but different ways of doing so. And she claims that P is not normally used to assert that P. These are some phenomena, some data I want to be able to explain, that at least in my view have not been explained by the extant literature. Some authors, like Bart and Harnish, try to explain the phenomenon of how it is that somebody who says I claim that P puts forth P as a claim. Try to explain this in terms of indirect speech acts. But as I've argued in a longer paper on which this talk is based, indirect speech acts are cancelable, whereas I claim that P, but P is false, is absurd in a way that corresponds to Morean type of absurdity. So it suggests that the indirect speech act approach is not going to work. Here's what I think of as a very condensed version of reconstruction of the reasoning that I think gives us an account of how I claim that P works, and also from the signaling perspective. And also, I think it should be clear how it generalizes to other so-called expositives. So premise one, suppose S has said, I claim that P with the objective, not intention, objective of conveying the information encoded by, I claim that P. And doing so in a way, of course, that in such a way as to meet those conditions C1 through Cn. Two, as is tokening of I claim that P is a verbal signal. That's just from the sufficient condition for verbal signaling that I gave you before. Three, S is tokening of I claim that P is a verbal index by 1 and 2 in the fact that in our sufficient condition for verbal signaling, those C1 through Cn conditions give us that sufficient condition. So from three, as is tokening of I claim that P is a verbal index allows us to infer 4, S claims that P. What they say is true. And from that is to say, verbal indexing is fact. But one who claims that P undertakes assertor commitment to P, I just put that down as a postulate relating assertions to commitments, and therefore S is also undertaking assertor commitment to P. So asserted and also undertaking or claims, but also undertaking assertor commitment. That I think is a way of explaining, for me, I find it a more plausible way of explaining how it is that somebody says I claim that P thereby undertakes assertor commitment to P, without us having to say that I claim that it's semantically transparent, without us having to appeal to direct speech acts. Okay, so that's what I want to say about self-ascriptions of force, what roughly speaking Austin would have called expositives. Let me close with a brief discussion of grammatical evidentials. This will be, and then I'll have some wrap-up comments after that. As most of you know, about 25% of the world's languages permit or require grammatical particles that indicate the epistemic source of a speaker's utterance, such as having been witnessed by the speaker, inferred by the speaker from evidence, heard from someone else, etc. As Sarah Murray points out, she studied the language in Cheyenne, a sentence like this, a many setse sandy, she glosses into English as Sandy sang, I heard, or hear, where the seste part is the grammatical evidential. In the gloss, the parenthetical is part of what the speaker says, but is not generally asserted. That's a little bit confusing. In English, in the English gloss, in English, when we have a grammatical evidential, the speaker says what's in the parentheses. Let me try to get it. In English, when we have a parenthetical, the speaker says what's within the grammar of the parenthetical. Speakers who background their information the way parentheticals facilitate are treated as being authoritative. In the grammatical evidential, the information is not part of what the speaker says, by contrast, but is also, like the case of parentheticals, part of not at issue content. And as Sarah Murray argues in her very nice book, Semantics of Evidentials from 2017, grammatical evidentials are invariably entered into conversation with common ground, unlike the proposition that they govern, so to speak. Let me explain a little more what she means by that. So she gives a tripartite analysis of evidentials as involving a presentation of at issue content, the non-grammatical evidential part, the not at issue restriction, and an illocution, that is the grammatical evidential part, and an illocutionary relation is her term, which is how the content operates on common ground is determined by the grammatical mood of the main clause. If it's indicative, it's going to operate one way. If it's interrogative, it's going to operate another. The not at issue content restrictions are not directly challengeable with the "that's not true" kind of repost, and will be added to common ground even if the at issue content is challenged or denied. Thus, not at issue restrictions are not proposals to update common ground. They simply do update it in a way similar to Stalnecker's notion of a manifest event, like a baseball crashing through your window. That's a manifest event that updates your conversational common ground, not a proposal, just does. Thus, an utterance of the Cheyenne sentence, whether or not it updates common ground with the proposition that Sandy's saying, invariably updates it with the content that the speaker heard that Sandy's saying. So think of grammatical evidentials, according to Murray's picture, as being like a baseball crashing through the window. They just update the common ground, the evidential part. And she provides a similar account of a Cheyenne sentence lost as "Annie won, I witnessed." That is to say, the eyewitness that Annie won, she says, updates common ground, but the proposition that Annie won is not automatically updated, used to update common ground. It's a proposal to update do so. But I think that's actually a very different case, and I want to explain why. Roughly speaking, if you witnessed it, if then that's part of common ground, then you also have to, common ground also has to conclude what was witnessed. That is to say, grammatical evidentials sometimes ricochet into common ground in a way that I think I can explain with the signaling model. So again, premise one, S has said P where star refers to the grammatical evidential and has said it with the objective of conveying the information encoded by I directly perceive the P, and speaker did so in such ways to meet appropriate conditions. They know where they have the conceptual resources, etc. S's tokening of P star is a verbal signal, because that's just given from one by the definition, by sufficient condition for verbal signaling. S's tokening of P star is also a verbal index by 1 and 2. But then P star is true. That is to say, in this case, they directly perceive that P, but perceive is a factive verb. If you perceive something that occurred, in which case P is true. Whoops. That is to say, here's a case in which, on my modification of Murray's model, the grammatical evidential guarantees the entry into common ground of the thing that the evidential governs. So the picture here is this approach gives us more power in thinking about how grammatical evidentials update common ground, not just with their own content, but content and propositions that they govern. It also allows us to answer questions about what is the force with which the grammatical evidential itself is put forward. I'm going to try to say something about that. Remember that, as I've suggested, speakers of English are treated as if they have final authority in what they claim, conjecture, guess, etc. And so for many other languages, of course. If Murray is correct that the content of grammatical evidentials are invariably entered into common ground, then it would seem that in GE, that is languages that are grammatical evidentials, speakers are treated as if they invariably know the epistemic status of what they say, at least when they use those grammatical evidentials. Some languages require all indicative sentences to be evidentialized in this way, others do not. So then there's no need to be responsible for responding to how do you know challenges when you use a grammatical evidential. In which case, here's one conjecture, grammatical evidentials are semi-assertions, not assertions. 2, if further speakers in such languages do in fact live up to this expectation, then 2, grammatical evidential languages are in this respect more epistemically vigilant linguistic communities than are non-grammatical evidential languages. In this respect, essentially, there's less room for bullshitting if you have to say where you got your information. And so here's one example in which philosophers of language should be grateful to linguists who actually force us to think about grammatical evidentials, because they help us understand the ways in which languages such as English and many other Romance languages, for example, by not having grammatical evidentials mandatorily, allow people to get away with things epistemically that speakers of other languages do not. So a bigger picture then, I'll close. Semanticity might have emerged through genetic or cultural evolution. That's, of course, a topic of current debate. Speech act norms most likely emerged through cultural evolution, according to the picture I'm offering here. And a cultural evolution approach to speech acts enables us to ask what role speech acts serve. They can ask us to pose stability questions. Under what conditions do these things break down? Can we imagine a situation in which a future group of language users have devolved from using assertions to semi-assertions or even assertions? They can allow us to reconsider what I call forced conventionals, with the idea that speech acts bring a notion of convention that's over and above the conventions that govern semanticity. And we can even imagine improvements in speech act practices from this evolutionary point of view. Could there be a way of improving a kind of conceptual engineering project that allows us to improve on assertor practices to make them somehow more stable, more reliable sources of information? And this approach allows us to formulate hypotheses that might be testable in, for instance, computer models about whether it's actually true, as I've conjectured, that moving from assertion to semi-assertion, or from semi-assertion to assertion, involves increased reliability of information transfer. It also sheds lights on current types of usage not easily characterized as any of the standard types of speech act. The examples that I've given are grammatical evidentials and self-ascriptions of force, such as I claim the P and those kinds of expositives. In the paper from which this work is drawn, I talk about conversational implicature as another thing that we can think about as being capable of being illuminated by means of this approach as something that's not illocuted, but rather either semi-asserted or asserted. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Okay, let me start by saying that I'm very happy to see and hear what Mitch is up to these days, because I think that speech acts are probably the most important topic that I can think of, at least in pragmatics. And it was about time that, and there's very little work on the evolution of speech acts, remarkably. Right. I knew a few papers, and but I'm very happy to see that the person who has met with the most experience when it comes to speech acts. I mean, Mitch has been working on speech acts since high school, basically. That he's started to do this job. And I agree with a lot of the things that he's saying about cultural evolution and the importance of commitment, and all that is rather predictable. Or it's predictable that I would agree with that. What I want to do is not so much raise objections, although I have a few critical remarks, but I want to raise a number of questions mainly, starting with the notion of speech acts. I have I've read the paper that Mitch referred to. So the quotes are from that paper, and most of them actually also appeared in some form in the talk. And one of the things he points out in his paper is that there's an influential tradition in the philosophy of language, and not just in the philosophy of language, which treats the speech act as the basic unit of communication. I'm not entirely sure that I agree with this. And the reason why I have some hesitation on this point is that there is also a tradition which is perhaps not as prominent in the philosophy of language, but which you can find, for instance, in the work of Herb Clark and Janet Bavelis and so on, who argue that even a speech act is actually a joint project. And there are a number of very nice examples which you could. Okay. So one of my favorites illustration is this from Clark and Wilkes Gibbs, who have this dialogue. That tree has, and then there's the speaker hesitates, and B completes or finds the word. It's tentworms, and then A says yes, and then B says yes. So what happens here is that A and B together conspire in allowing A to make a speech act, right? That, in a sense, or at least the commitment that A wants to make is something that B helps to bring about. Now, these are special cases, but there are other cases like back channeling and that sort of thing, where it is clear that this classical model that the A is sending and B is receiving is passively receiving is probably wrong, and that makes and in a sense, what I've been doing in my work on commitment basically incorporates these ideas in the very notion of a commitment. Right? You can, in my account, you cannot make a commitment unless the other party makes commitments as well. Right? So the interactivity is there in a sense also in the relations, the normative relations that you bring about. And my question is basically, in the light of that sort of developments, what are we to make of this idea that speech acts are the basic units of human communication? My second, there are a couple of main questions here, is that, I mean, a large part of the paper is on assertions and assertion and similar speech acts. I was wondering if you, I mean, I've been working a bit on the evolution of speech acts, and I don't think assertions are, in my view, not the most obvious place to start. Because if you look at the kind of communication in chimpanzees that is the most similar to ordinary human communication, you would probably go to the gestures and not to the vocalizations. And you would go to face-to-face contexts, and rather than broadcasting. So rather than looking at alarm calls, I would go to the kinds of things that chimpanzees do with gestures, and those are predominantly used to coordinate interactions between individuals. So part of my one question is, why start with assertions, right? If the kinds of things that chimpanzees do with gestures are probably not more like requests and proposals for joint action and so on and on, right? Rather than assertion. And the other part of it is, why start with alarm calls? If it is the case that face-to-face communication is probably where human communication or human style communication started. And by the way, that's also Seyfarth and Cheney's position, right? So they say in a more recent work that alarm calls may be of limited use when thinking about the evolution of language. And what they have in mind here is exactly this is the second point that I just made, that face-to-face communication is probably more important. So why not start there? This is a picture that you've seen in a somewhat prettier form, and I was looking at this, and one of the things that struck me was that liability, whereas frankness and fidelity appear in many different forms, right? Liability seems to be always the same thing. So either you're liable or you're not, which made me wonder whether it is, first, whether it's true that liability is the same in the case of assertion as in the case of conjecture. And intuitively, at least, I would say it isn't. So that's one question. Another point is that I think it would be interesting to have a closer look at the connections between these three dimensions. So the connection, for instance, between liability and frankness. And one of the things that I've done in my work on commitment is I try to show that if you look at what I take to be core commitments associated with requests and assertions and promises, etc., where commitment is a social notion, it's a relation between people, it's a relation between individuals, then you can derive at least some of the frankness commitments that Mitch lists here. So I think I'm not arguing that is necessarily, that what I was trying to do was not necessarily correct. But I think it would be nice if we had dimensions that, and liability would, or something like liability might be a candidate, which enable us to say that the frankness dimension is somehow derivable from the liability dimension. So again, this is a question. I mean, it isn't, and it's in order to do this, I mean, liability would have to be something richer. right? And it would have to mean something different for assertion than for conjecture, for instance. I mean, there might be a common core, but it couldn't be the same, or otherwise the frankness dimension would be the same throughout as well. And another point that I wanted to raise is, I mean, if you have 3 dimensions, and then the obvious question is to ask yourself is, what else could you distinguish? What other dimensions could you think of? Right? And I have 2 possible suggestions. One is a distinction between discursive and non-discursive commitments. Right? So discursive commitments, that's Brandam's term for commitments to talk in certain ways, but not others. Right? And I think that distinction is a good candidate for something. I think discursive commitments are a good candidate for something that appeared relatively late. Right? It doesn't seem to be something very primitive. Right? And another distinction that I was thinking of is degrees of commitment. There is, intuitively, there is such a thing. Right? And intuitively, assertion is something stronger or is associated with stronger commitments than conjecture, for instance. And I was wondering whether that dimension might help. And that's something that perhaps would be a better candidate for something that's relatively primitive. One of the things that Mitch writes in his paper is that he's taking it that there could be a practice of assertion, I hope I pronounce this correctly, that is not also governed by a norm of sincerity. And I mainly want to say I think I think he's right. I think it's possible to make commitments of a sort by means of something like assertion. Which don't imply or cause you to be committed to have certain beliefs. For instance, because you don't have the notion of belief yet, right? And in a sense that's also in the account that I propose in my 2019 paper, where sincerity is derived. I think it was a mistake to call them implicatures, and Mitch kindly took me to task for this. But they are pragmatic inferences. And the interesting aspect here is that the way I derive sincerity inferences from core commitments, right, basically implies that they are that being sincere is advantageous to the speaker in its own right. Being sincere is easier than not being sincere. That's basically what it comes down to. Right? If something like cooperation is involved, it becomes something like an implicature. Right? So there are 2 sides to these inferences, and it could start could be kickstarted by the fact that it's cheaper to be sincere. Last point, there's this notion of, which wasn't in the talk, but Mitch briefly talked about it, of unavoidable context changes. So here's a quote: this is about performatives, a felicitously uttered, and this is about Jerry, but I think Steve or Mitch agrees with this. A felicitously uttered performance sentence serves as a manifest event. It is as sure to update the common ground with the information that the speaker has performed a certain act as is a rock crashing through a window. In the talk, it was a baseball, but otherwise the example is similar. I have some doubts about this notion of something that inevitably changes the context. I think in principle, it's always possible for the addressee to say something like, "I didn't hear you," or I shall pretend that I didn't hear that. Right? And if you do that, then the whole attempt of getting something into the common ground fails, right? Or at least we are committed. to the assumption that it failed. So these are so I think my impression is that it's a matter of degree rather than an absolute distinction between unavoidable context changes and others. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. So, Mitch, if you want to react to that in 3 or 4 minutes or so, for 3 or 4 minutes, please. Before we
Yes, thanks very much. I appreciate that. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And I appreciate your comments, Bart. They're very helpful. Give me lots of good stuff to think about going forward. I do think I agree with most of what you say, but I think that I can agree with it in some respects without having to change too much of the tenor of what I'm saying here. So I have no problem, I think, accepting the idea that speech acts are often a joint project of speaker and addressee. I still think that that does not undermine the claim. I mean, if I were someone who believed that the basic unit of human communication is the speech act, I think I could take that joint project idea on board and still say, well, yeah, those are still, the basic unit then is still a collaborative activity. So I think that someone could accept that while still holding that view. But notice that, when I say it's widely accepted the basic unit of speech act, I'm pushing back against that because I want to say that's a controversial claim. And in particular, we shouldn't go from the premise that humans are the unique species that use the speech acts in the Austinian sense to therefore it's somehow essential to language use that that utterances are speech acts. That seems to be a further conclusion to draw that does not entail by the premises. So the first point is I think I can agree with the joint project point and still have essentially my opponent taking that on board, but then I still want to disagree with my opponent. I do think that when you say assertion is not the obvious place to start in thinking about speech acts from an evolutionary point of view, I would say I am absolutely open to thinking about the evolution of things of a more imperatival kind. So commands, so to speak, where could they have come from if we think about them from a cultural evolutionary point of view? I think that would be a wonderful complementary project. I don't think the assertion the genealogy of assertion project is in any way at odds with the genealogy of imperatives project. I think the two would probably complement each other very nicely. So I very much welcome that, your suggestions, and I know you've thought about that yourself. So there's a lot of your own work that I think we could just take on board, recast in more cultural evolutionary terms. You don't put that explicitly in your writings, I think, but it wouldn't be that much of an overhaul to make that change. It seems to me I think that would be very welcome. So I don't think this is competing with that. I would say whether communication is face-to-face or gestural for me is a relatively superficial difference. What matters is sort of the functional status of these things. I focused on the verb at alarm calls just because they allow me to talk about, I think so many people discuss the idea of non-human animals using language that's only restricted to the here and now, to which I'd say, I think that's at best an overstatement, or communicative systems that are restricted to the here and now. I think that's at best an overstatement. When we have alarm calls concerning predators that might be far away, for example, they're not particularly here and now. I'd also say that, when we've got signaling systems, among, for example, when when non-human animal signals, if that's in fact what's going on, it's genetic fitness. There's a way in which that's epistemically not very accessible. There's a way in which signaling my genetic fitness is a way of my signaling something that's not easily discernible with the eye. That's why that might be why animals do what they do. So I would say the here and now, and likewise face-to-face, gestural and otherwise, strike me as orthogonal to the kinds of questions I'm asking, because I want to ask really more. If we have something that's got some semanticity, some communicated system that's got some semanticity, then the question is, what, if any, force can we use? What kind of notion of force can we use to describe the way in which these content-like things are being put forward? I'd be interested in hearing more about why you think liability looks different in the case of assertion from the way it looks in the case of conjecture. It seems to me, I just want to think of them, I'm just being as flat-footed as I can be here. I think of them as both cases in which you're either right or wrong on what it is that you assert or conjecture, depending on whether that proposition is true or false. I want to characterize the difference between assertion and conjecture, the different rows, but I'm thinking almost stipulatively as liability is being a very, very simple notion. And I'd even say that a non-human animal that signals something is the case is also liable to be right or wrong, depending upon whether what they signal is the case. So the deceptive, mutant tree frog is wrong in signaling as he does that he's toxic. So I'm trying to keep it as a very primitive notion, hoping I can get away with that. And then the last thing I want to say is that I'm on board with the idea of degrees of commitment. The way I try to capture that, the way in which I want to say that, for example, assertion involves a stronger commitment than conjecture does. And both of them involve a stronger commitment than guessing does, is in terms of the fidelity constraint, because you're on the hook to do more when you assert than you are when you conjecture, than you are when you guess. And so that's why I'm kind of capturing that notion of degree. If we think there's a sort of richer notion of more or less that applies to these types of speech acts, then I'm all ears, I want to hear about it. I just haven't been able to figure out what exactly that would be. And I should notice that I definitely agree that frankness, let me try it again, fidelity, unlike frankness and liability, are discursive types of commitments in random sense. And so I just wasn't using that terminology, but it seems to me pretty clear that you can't undertake a fidelity related commitment without already having a reasonably sophisticated discursive structure in which to work or to give reasons for what you say. But I wouldn't want to say that, I'm not sure how strongly I want to put that, whether or not I want to put that as an absolute firm boundary, because sometimes if you challenge what I say, I might just point to the thing that is my evidence for my assertion or what it is that I say. And is that discursive? I'm not quite sure. It's not as if I'm, the gesture towards the water source that I just told you about, I'd say, look over there, or just point you. Is that a discursive way of responding to the challenge? I'm not quite sure. So the boundaries between discursive and non-discursive strike me as a little bit porous. And final thing, I guess I'll say, I completely agree that the idea of an unavoidable context change is an idealization at best. And in fact, the baseball or rock through the window as being a manifest event and unavoidable, that only updates common ground if people are paying attention and notice that one another are paying attention. So I think we need to just note the fact that we're idealizing there, and this is going to be a difference of degree, not of kind. That's it. Thanks very much. And I really appreciate the time and effort you've spent on responding insightfully to my talk. Bart. Much appreciated.